I'm going to be sharing some words about October 7th. There's children or littles here. It's okay if you want to step out. We've got some great children's programs outside. Good Yantif. On Rosh Hashanah, on the second day, most of you were here, I offered a pathway for dealing with the radical disorientation that we experienced following the horrific acts of October 7th. I shared that at times when the world, which we know, falls apart, the rabbis turn to stories of our tradition for empathy, guidance, and vision. One of the stories I proposed we needed to hear this year was the story of Esther. Esther's feat, I shared, was that she saw anti-Semitism, Haman, stood up to it, left her castle, and rallied her people against it. Today, I would like to share another story that we need to hear, the story of Ruth. Ruth and Esther both offer us guidance for how to deal and balance the two emotions that accompany being in a state of radical disorientation, the emotions of fear and anger. For those of us experiencing fear, Esther modeled what it means to be strong and to act with courage. For those of us dealing with anger, we can turn to Ruth. According to Dr. Mark Brackett, the director of the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, anger is the emotional reaction when we experience injustice. When I think about what unfolded on October 7th and the events following that day, I just feel angry. Is anyone else angry? What does it mean to be angry? I am so angry, I cannot hear. I cannot hear viewpoints that challenge my way of how I understand Israel. If the rabbis say that the words of Hillel were selected over the words of Shammai because Hillel would share the words of Shammai in their answers, thereby demonstrating how they could hear the other side, I must admit, I am on the side of Shammai. I do not want to recognize any different narratives or points of view other than those that affirm our right to a country and right to be safe within it. I am so angry, I cannot see. I do not have the emotional strength to see beyond the places and people I know and care about. I only see places like Kibbutz Sa'ad, where I lived during my first year of the Nativ program in Israel, or Kibbutz Givim, our sister kibbutz where our students visited during their last Israel trip. These two kibbutzim are located in Sha'ar HaNegev, in the Gaza envelope, and they mobilized on October 7th and fended off the terrorists, but have spent the last year dispersed across the country. School took place for these students on Zoom sessions, while the adults had to manage their work responsibilities by traversing across the state multiple hours each day, or had to balance their work duties with their miluim, Army Reserve student service, that has been increased in frequency and in length to accommodate for the war efforts. And of course, who is maintaining the beautiful fields of these kibbutzim, the ones I labored in as a young 18-year-old? Who is harvesting the carrots? Who is picking the almonds? Who is milking the cows? I cannot see beyond the many stories of the hostages taken and the 1,200 people who were victims on October 7th. I think about the tragic story of Livnat Kutz. She was a talented businesswoman working in the tech industry who left her work to move with her family to Sha'ar HaNegev. There she opened an art studio at the local school to teach crafts for students of all ages and learning styles. During the earlier wars with Hamas in Gaza, she would use art to help students deal with the trauma of the Tzeva Adom, or red alerts. When the Tzeva Adom flared, children had to run to shelters to avoid being hit by the shrapnel of a Qassam rocket. She taught the children art to decorate the shelters so the places they ran to were less frightening, and she helped them draw their emotions on paper that they could not describe with words. When it was my turn to bring our teens to Israel, Livnat and I worked together to come up with an art project that would help link our two teen populations that were thousands of miles apart. She died tragically with her family, holding each other in the same room on October 7th. She was a teacher, an artist, a healer, a mother, and a wife, and she died tragically. She should be here. How can I see anything else beyond the injustice that occurred to her and our people? October 7th was not the first time we had to deal with atrocities being committed against us, and similarly, this is not the first time we have carried anger. Perhaps the most powerful description of Jewish rage comes from the poem of Israel's first national poet, Chaim Nachman Bialik. In 1903, while teaching Hebrew in Odessa, upon learning of the Kishinev pogrom, Bialik writes, Shamaim, bakshu rachamim alai, im yesh bachem elu la levavchem nativ, va'ani lo mitzativ, hitpalelu atem alai, ani libi met, ve'ein od tefila bisfatai, uchvar azalt yad af ein tikva, od ad matai, ad anna, ad matai. O heavens, beg mercy for me. If a God be in you, with a way in you, a way that I never knew, pray unto him for me. My own heart is dead, prayer drained from my tongue. The hands lie limp and hope undone. How long? Until when? How much longer? In the face of the Kishinev massacre, Bialik cries out in anger to God. Where are you? He cries out. He is speaking for me. Does he speak for you as well? Later, Bialik is tasked by the local Jewish authority to go to Kishinev and take a detailed accounting of what took place. Upon seeing the horrors experienced by the men, the women, and the children, and the silence of the larger community, he writes the following in his poem in the poem called Town of Slaughter. O Hasmoneans lay with trembling knees, concealed and cowering, the sons of the Maccabees. Listen to him describe our heroes, the Maccabees, as hiding with trembling knees. At that time, he was both speaking to himself and to the worldwide Jewish community. In his anger, he was calling them out. Where was our bravery? How could we allow this to happen? Bialik is also speaking for us today, and he is verbalizing an internal cry many of us carry for in this room when we think of the atrocities of October 7th. The cries of, how could I, after being raised on the promise, never again allow another pogrom to happen? Taking my experiences and the words of Chaim Bialik together, where does our anger leave us? Blind, deaf, lost, and feeling weak. It is in our anger that we turn to Ruth for help. When the rabbis were asked, why is Ruth included in our canon? Rabbi Zera answered, the story of Ruth teaches us how good the reward is for those who do chesed, kindness. Dr. Yael Ziegler notes that while there are many examples of kindness in our Torah, what makes Ruth's kindness noteworthy is that the kindness Ruth displays is selfless, and even comes at a risk of her health and safety. The first time we see Ruth expressing herself, it is in the wilderness of Moab. She has followed her father-in-law and husband to the desert there to avoid the famine in Israel. After her father-in-law and husband die, Ruth wants to stay with her mother-in-law, Naomi. Naomi turns to Ruth and explains the inherent risks associated with this choice. She would not be able to marry, and she would not have a family or legacy of her own. Despite these warnings to her well-being, she turns to Naomi and says the words many of us are familiar with. Vatomer Ruth, al tifkei bi lazveich, lashuv me'acharaich, ki el asher techi elech, uvasher talini alin, amech ami, ve'elohaich Elohai. Do not urge me to leave you, to turn back and not follow you. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. This pattern can be seen throughout her story. Upon returning to Israel with Naomi, Ruth voluntarily relinquishes her dignity and gathers produce in the field to obtain food for herself and Naomi. Later, Ruth agrees to risk her reputation by stealthily approaching Boaz alone at night on the threshing floor. Finally, she even bears a child and allows Naomi to raise him as her own. All of these kindnesses have one thing in common. Ruth repeatedly sacrifices her own personal interests for the benefit of others. In a dark and scary world, Ruth chooses kindness. Like the book of Esther, God plays a very small role in the book. Where is God to be found in her story? Today, in our Machzorim, we recognize God as being Notzer Chesed La'alafim, a God who embodies kindness. Where is God? God can be found through the actions of Ruth. While Bialik searches in agony for God, Ruth embodies the godliness that Bialik is looking for. Instead of crying and holding out her hands, Ruth leans in, she helps, and she supports others who are in need. To those of us angry with God, Ruth pushes us not to be stagnant, but to see within ourselves the power to help and to heal. Her story reminds me of a recent phone call I received from my mother, who in her very young age, bad back and all, participated last month in one of the volunteer trips coordinated by JNF USA. I could hear through the phone her tears of gratitude for the work she was privileged to do in Sha'ar HaNegev. At a pop-up kitchen, she would reach deep into the corners of the refrigerators so she could wipe away the molds so they would be clean to store food for our soldiers. She painted playgrounds in Sha'ar HaNegev for children to return to, and she even spent a full day cooking meals for soldiers and displaced residents. There is another lesson of Ruth. Her story teaches us what it means to see and hear others, something the book demonstrates through its usage of names. The opening 2 verses of her book are merely identical, with one exception. In the first verse, the characters do not have names. Ruth writes, "A man went from Bethlehem in Judah to live in the fields of Moab, he, his wife, and his 2 sons." And in the second verse, the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi. The name of his 2 sons were Machlon and Chilion. The opening verses of the book of Ruth draw our attention to the way this family hovers between having names and namelessness. Similarly, we too live in a world where we can choose to interact with others by using names or not. To have a name is to have an identity or a story. A name shows that we are aware that there was someone who named you. When we call someone by their name, we see their humanity. We all know that one of the essential tools for belonging is being a place where everyone knows your name. On the contrary, someone who is nameless lacks identity. And when we refer to someone without their name, their humanity is viewed on a diminishing scale. At best, we don't know them. At worst, we see them as objects undeserving of care or basic inalienable rights. Building off of this idea, there is a pivotal moment in the book of Ruth, and it occurs when she first meets Boaz. Boaz ends up becoming Ruth's husband, and together they will have a child who will be the forefather of King David. At the moment, though, when Boaz first sees Ruth, he has a choice to make. He can see her as just another worker in his fields, akin to a stranger, akin to an object, or he can look at her and see a human being in need of help. What is the first question Boaz asks her? What is your name? And only once Ruth shares her name with Boaz does their relationship begin. One of the sad truths about learning Jewish history is the multiple times we as Jews were not seen or treated as human beings. Many of us in this room recall the lesson of the Holocaust was that we were more than numbers, we had names. As the Israeli poet Zelda teaches, Lechol ish yesh shem. Every person has a name. The primary purpose of our canon, though, is not to educate the world around us, but rather to educate ourselves. Before Ruth's lesson about the power of names can be shared to the world, it must be owned by us. I therefore wonder if Ruth's story is meant for those of us who are so blinded by our anger that it limits the scope of who we see as worthy of having a name. It is one of the tragedies of October 7th. In our anger, we are in danger of seeing the world in the way our enemies see us. Lastly, Ruth reveals our true power, and it can be seen in the radical way it treats the Moabites. According to our Torah in the book of Deuteronomy, no Moabite shall come into the congregation for eternity. Because of the matter, they did not meet you with food and water on your journey after you left Egypt. Our Torah forbade us from welcoming the Moabites into our community because at a time of need, they were not there for us. And yet, Ruth is a Moabite. Ruth the Moabite breaks the heartless pattern of her people and helps us at our time of need. As a result, a person who should have been left outside is not only welcomed into the community of Israel, but she becomes the foremother of King David. The story of Ruth demonstrates the courageous willingness to adjust our divine laws so that they support the universal value of chesed and kindness. While it seems radical, perhaps it's not at all. If we are to be a light unto the nations, if we are to model how we treat one another, our halakha, our Jewish law, should always contort so that it can best support these aims. While Esther reminds us to stand up for ourselves, the story of Ruth reminds us of who we are. We are a people whose mission is to be notzer chesed la'alafim, preserving kindness for 1,000 generations. God knows the world needs us now more than ever. Today on Yom Kippur, bowed in prayer, we turn to God, a God that embodies two contradictory traits, the trait of judgment, or din, and the trait of mercy, rachamim. To the God of Din, we ask to execute judgment on those who have been in the wrong, who are wicked and who are evil. This is the God of Esther, who upon seeing anti-Semitism and Jewish hatred, boldly stood up to them and tore them down. And to the God of Rachamim, we ask for empathy to those who stumble and fall, to grant to those who have fallen short the benefit of the doubt, and to give those of us who have made mistakes second chances. This is the God of Ruth, who led with a warm and caring heart and enabled us to overcome our weaknesses so that we could be our best selves. Not only do we pray to the God of mercy and judgment, but robed in white, our work is to also see how we have it within ourselves to emulate God and walk in God's ways. We are thus tasked with wearing both of these crowns, of Esther and Ruth, of judgment and mercy. Alas, I must admit, I am sorry, but I cannot carry both crowns this year. The memories of October 7th burn too deeply within me. I cannot let go of my anger. Can you? If you are like me, I encourage you to turn to the book of Jonah that we will read this afternoon. At the end of his story, Jonah stands apart from God. He cannot carry both the crowns of judgment and mercy, as he does not understand how God could forgive the people of Nineveh. Why not? It could be that after following God, go back and forth with this decision on what to do with them, he did not have the strength to follow God again. Wearing the two crowns draws upon us to have a deep well of patience. It could be he did not understand why the people of Nineveh should be forgiven. Wearing the two crowns requires profound wisdom. It could even be that Jonah wanted to stop Nineveh, as it was the capital of an Assyrian empire that would eventually defeat the northern tribes of Israel. Wearing the crowns requires balancing our virtues and our need for safety. I am Jonah. I am alone, and I am standing somewhere between the walls of Nineveh and the land of Israel. I am not at ease. I do not have shelter, and the sun is beating down on my skin. Where I stand is not sustainable. I see God, yet I cannot walk to God. Not now, not this year. And on this day of Yom Kippur, I ask for God's forgiveness for this. Perhaps next year, I will take the hands of Esther and Ruth, and together they will guide me so that I can return home. Adonai oz le'amo yiten, Adonai yevarech et amo v'shalom. Thank you, God, for giving us oz, strength, to make it through the year. Now help us find in the land of Israel and in our soul a secure and lasting peace. And let us say, Amen. Shana Tova.